Hello and welcome to the Rover Podcast, the most conservative podcast on the internet. This is Isaac Wilde. To my right, or your left, I guess, is Christopher Curtis.
You know how fucking insane this would have to be for this to be the most conservative podcast on the internet? You know how crazy those opinions would have to be?
And we have our guest today, Ted, we will be talking about the police, the flicks, as they say in French. And so thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy our content, we ask you to please go check out the rover.ca/support-us. That's the rover.ca/support-us. Shut up, Chris. And we are completely reader funded. Chris makes his living off of people donating charitably to his excellent work. And please check it out. Please go like and subscribe.
Charitably
to this
makes it sound like
you don't get a charity receipt from it.
You will not. And like it's a product. It's a product.
And you could argue
it's not charity.
It's even like the opposite of charity because it's attacking people constantly.
Jesus
and so
Christ. I love you, Isaac.
You regret hiring me?
No, I love you.
I know you say that, but
yeah.
Ted, how are you today, my friend?
Ted Rutland, ladies and gentlemen.
Ted Rutland.
I'm doing all right. Happy to be here with you guys.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you, man. Listen, well, I wanted to start off the conversation with Chris. Can you tell us about anything that you've been working on? Anything they should specifically check out for the Rover?
Well, I'm actually working on a piece about the encampment. I was going to talk to Ted about it.
Great.
There was a pretty hard crackdown on the encampments on Monday by the SPVM. Some footage showed up some pretty gratuitous use of batons, which, like, knowing the police's own sort of like use of force continuum, the logic behind the baton is like you have to have exhausted a lot of things before getting to hitting people with the baton. So. And they didn't appear to
straight to that option.
Yeah, I think they went. So it just seemed, even on the police's own pretty liberal standards of use of force, it seemed excessive. And we just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into like what is the UQAM encampment. We know there's a McGill encampment, but there's also a Solidarity encampment at Université du Québec and Montréal. What's the sort of status of encampments across Canada?
Yeah,
and just because, look, it's on everyone's mind. The war is not winding down. It seems like everyone's desperate. You've had the ICJ arrest warrants issue, or they've announced that they're seeking arrest warrants. So it's kind of hard to ignore right now. It's sort of the biggest news item in the city and in the world, in my opinion. That's what we're working on, and actually, it's great that Ted's here today because we. Actually, by the time this airs, probably the story will be out. So
okay, so yeah,
enjoy the great story that Ted is quoted in.
Please, on therover.ca and sign up for that newsletter, free or paid, on therover.ca/support-us. Ted, I would love to know a little bit about you.
I'm a prof at Concordia University. I do a lot of research around police violence and urban politics, and I also try to help out, activist struggles, mostly against police violence and racism. Within a sort of logic of defund the police, move towards abolishing the police.
So your goal is to hopefully see a day where we defund and abolish the police?
Definitely. I mean, absolutely. Do I think that that's going to happen in my life? Do I think we're going to abolish the police in my lifetime? I don't predict that we will, but I think, and we'll probably get into this. I think that abolition brings a particular way of understanding the police that can inform the way that we talk about it and the way that we fight it. It doesn't necessarily mean that we either abolish the police or nothing, or we haven't achieved anything. Okay. But it sort of gets away from some of the more naive ways in which people think that they can reduce some of the harms of policing.
Well, can we get right into that? Can you tell us in what way? Because I can guarantee you right now that in the YouTube comments, there are people saying, you guys are fucking stupid. Abolishing the police is stupid. And so can you explain more of why you think that? It won't satiate people who are just up in arms about it, but for people who are more moderate, people who are thinking about it, who understand like the problems, can you explain why that would be potentially a good place to start from? Like, why would it be good to abolish the police or change our system?
Sure. And the usual response I get is like, yeah, sure, abolish the police until you need them. And it's like,
right.
I would start by saying,
always the response.
Are there situations in which calling the police is the least worst option in our society today? Of course. So what are the police? I mean, the police are violence workers. Their specialty is the use of violence, which they don't always use, but that violence is sometimes held in reserve. It's the threat of potentially using violence that allows them to do their work, you know? So either they beat you with a baton, they can shoot you, or they can say, move here, or let me arrest you, and you have to do it because they can harm you. Okay, so again, are there situations today where it might be useful to be able to call someone to come in with a gun and the power of arrest? Of course. But if we can recognize that their work is violence, then we can start to say, well, is that the best way of keeping each other safe? And it's like, no, there's a bunch of other things we need to be doing, all kinds of things. We can also recognize that the police can prevent harm, but they also cause harm a lot. And so maybe we should want to reduce their role as much as possible. And so it's basically a perspective that makes us understand that it's normal that the police are violent. It's normal that they're oppressive. That's what they're created to do. That's what they've always done. We can't change that, but we can reduce the scope of policing, and we can do a lot of other things that keep us safe that the police will never do. You know, one example is like the war on drugs, for example. It's kind of the easiest example, right? At the beginning, it was premised on the idea that drugs can cause harms. It was also premised on a lot of moral and racist ideas about drug users. And the objective is to take all the drugs off the street. Okay, so we know that hasn't succeeded. And what it actually has done is put a lot of people in prison. It's made the drug supply much less safe. You know, it's led drug organizations to prioritize getting stuff across the border efficiently rather than like drugs that are good to take and that are relatively safe. And so we have tens of thousands of people dying from a toxic drug supply. So where does this end? I mean, do we want more policing? Do we want to double down on removing drugs from the street, which will never happen? Or do we want to think about how to actually keep people safe? Can we accept that people will do drugs? And we can say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but accept that they do and try to think about how to make sure that in a context where some people will use drugs sometimes, that all people are as safe as possible. And if we can accept that, then we realize that the police have very little to do with that. And in fact, what we need to do is have a legal, regulated drug supply. We need to have good popular education for people to know what drugs do and don't do, how to use them safely if you're going to use them, and really effective, free and available rehab for people who want that. People shouldn't be forced into rehab, but when people want it, they should have that available. And we can sort of go issue by issue, Yeah. So I'm not saying that there's a mass murder, that we should just let them, But we could maybe try to create a society where there are fewer mass murderers. We don't really work on that.
So in the case where the police are abolished, what do we do when there's a mass murder?
Wait, but I think before. Oh, actually, sorry. That's please, go for it.
No, but if someone's going to say, well, we need like a specialized force for those rare cases where there's a mass murder, I'm okay with that, But we should also be making sure we're doing everything we can to make sure that there are fewer mass murderers. And we know there's lots of things you can do to prevent violence, to help people to deal with, the ways that we respond with violence to difficult emotions. We don't want to talk about the fact, for example, that you're most likely to be harmed by someone someone who maybe even lives in your house. Like, we don't want to deal with that. We like the idea.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it almost 50% of women who are killed by a current or former partner, and like when there's an instance of physical or sexual violence, when someone is kidnapped, all these really big violent crimes almost always happen within a family or within a tight-knit group, so a very close friend of the family, an uncle, a cousin, whatever. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just saying like that to me is much more common than somebody breaks into your house and kills everyone. That's just, there's no logic to that. Yeah.
It's like in movies and stuff we depict, sexual assault.
I was going to say, I think it's the culture, right?
Yeah. People running up to you in the streets and attacking you, but it's like, no, it's usually a family member, an uncle, that kind of stuff.
And it's funny, right? Because like you say, we should reduce the size of the police or we should abolish the police, and they immediately go to like mass murder or like someone who's going to kill you and chase you down in the street, and somehow the police will intervene and stop that person from killing you once they've already decided they want to. It's never like, what are you going to do about domestic violence? Because we know that police don't do anything about domestic violence. We
already don't.
They sometimes arrest the person after the fact, and sometimes that's what the person who was harmed wants. But like, ideally, we would do everything we can to stop the violence from occurring in the first place. And when we believe that the police keep us safe, then we avoid those discussions about how we could prevent the violence from occurring in the first place.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna like, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but there are studies that show the more cops you have on the streets, the fewer homicides you'll have. Like, I'm not saying this is right, but there is a body of work that sort of demonstrates how when you have more cops, you have less violent crime. Maybe just in Canada, maybe not in the United States. I don't know, but you've obviously seen this.
Sure. So the studies.
How do you respond to that?
The studies that show that are actually about sort of flooding a neighborhood with cops, and so it reduces crime and other kinds of it reduces violence in that neighborhood. So you can do that, if you put a cop.
But it's almost like it's an occupation. It's like almost like a military occupation of that neighborhood.
And it displaces it. Obviously, if you saturate one area with police, some crime is going to be reduced in that area, no question. But it'll be displaced elsewhere because you haven't dealt with the root causes of things. You're also probably assuming that you're going to, it displaces it in time too. Like if you arrested everybody in the society, you would decrease crime to zero. But like they're
I like the sound of that.
New solution just dropped.
Sorry.
As long as you keep people in prison forever, then you're fine. But like people are going to get out, and do people emerge from prison in a better or worse condition? I think we all understand that like prison is not the place where we haven't
written extensively about that at the Rover. No, we haven't explored that situation at all. In Montreal, if you leave a prison. If you get out of Bordeaux, you are 66%. 66% of people who are released from Bordeaux are back in Bordeaux within 2 years. So do prisons make the world safer? I don't know.
The Rover has done such incredible reporting. This is how I was introduced to the Rover. Actually, it was Chris's reporting on the jailing system. And it's
the fact that you're my downstairs neighbor. That's like that also might help.
I mean, to your work, not to you as a person, but like, basically, like I don't think there's another journal in the country that's done this extensive of reporting.
There's a lot of really good reporting out there. Is it all concentrated in like one media? No, but there's a lot of really good reporting, but there is not enough good reporting.
Chris is the only one.
And and actually Ted, you've written op-eds for the Gazette. You've written op-eds in French as well, right? For La Presse?
French, yeah, mostly for La Presse and Le Devoir people.
And Le Devoir. Like I don't think someone like you would have been writing about, like, I don't picture your columns appearing in a newspaper 20 years ago. Okay. And I really enjoy, like, I don't generally love opinion and analysis, but I love like whatever you write. Like I didn't know you had a Substack, and I started just reading all your shit because I love it. Like I love understanding how this big, opaque, especially in Quebec, we have there's so much police data we don't get to see. I love understanding how the machine works. Because I have friends who are cops, and I know people, and I don't begrudge them. Like I love them. They're, we're siblings in Christ, but I think the institution is so deeply problematic. And I heard someone say the other day, like, if we could invent a new system of justice, it is extremely unlikely that we would recreate what we have now. And I don't know. Is there a segue so we've complimented you, Ted, accept it. Is there a segue here to a question about, I think what's on everyone's minds lately, the encampments at McGill. The police have actually, you would think that there are these two contradictory set of facts. The police have been to court to argue against an injunction that would see the police called in to empty out the McGill encampment. And then a few, like a week later, not even a week later, the police crack down really hard on the camp at Université du Québec at Montréal. So like, how do you square those two facts? How can the same police force that's arguing against, almost in favor of free speech, it would seem, then crack down on it days later? How does that work, Ted?
Yeah, great question. And, I'll tell you what I think, but it's anybody's. We're never going to know, right? Because ideally, we could just ask the police, and they would tell us. But they've said a bunch of things, and we can't take any of the things that they've said seriously. So we have to kind of like try to see how this would make sense, given the way that the police operate. And so the first thing I would say is, I think the primary reason the police haven't attacked the students at McGill is not on the basis of some principle of free speech, but it's a public relations decision. And so the police are incredibly violent and harass unhoused people, Black and Indigenous people, people with mental illness all the time, day in and day out.
And there's significant, just real quick, there's a lot of evidence to back that. This is not something you're inventing. Report after report after report using the police's own data shows that, if you're an Indigenous woman, I think you're 11 times more likely to be stopped than if you're white. If you're Black, it's 4 times. Yeah. So sorry, just these studies exist. It's observable not only in like one study, but multiple studies of police data over years and years and years. So sorry, I just want to make sure that like we're crystal clear that this we might call it something different, but the police do routinely interact with marginalized people a lot more than, say, a white guy with a mustache.
Yes. And so they do that. There's also sadly a large amount of public support for that. I mean, since 2020, we've seen like people calling for more sort of police intervention in areas where there's deemed to be gun violence. We've seen calls for more policing in metro stations where unhoused people are spending time because it's the best place for them. So like this is normal practice. The police have the public support to do that. The majority of the population, and that's a sad thing. I don't think the police have anything to gain in terms of public relations to like bust down an encampment and harm a bunch of students and have videos of them harming students go viral. So I think they have made a decision for the time being about the McGill encampment that they don't want to go in and bust down an encampment, harm a bunch of students based on public relations. So then we can ask, well, why are they attacking the UQAM encampment? And I think that there it's helpful to think about this term that a lot of Black activists and intellectuals have used, which is counterinsurgency, which is a form of policing that really emerged in the 1960s in response to radical Black activism in North America. And a lot of that was about combating this radical Black activism, but also pushing Black activism towards more acceptable forms. So you're really hard on the Black Panther Party, for example. You kill these people, you put them in prison. You're less hard on some more mainstream kinds of activism. And I think that's what we've seen in relation to the pro-Palestine struggle. So the police were extremely brutal against a couple of direct actions on April 15th, including something that didn't get very mediatized, an attempt to block the port of Montreal, as well as an action at Scotiabank. Extremely brutal. Like pepper spraying.
Yeah, they arrested Savannah at Scotiabank. Savannah Craig, who is a journalist who identified herself as a journalist, and they still, as of yet, they're still seeking to charge her with public mischief, despite all this evidence that she's just doing her job. Yeah, sorry, and her job is watching the police, and this is what happens when I've lately, and this is not like just Montreal. This is across the West, especially North America. When you watch the police, or when you make it known that you're watching the police, there are acts of intimidation in return.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk maybe later if you want about how the police have they have very good spokespeople in the media. So they have their journalists that they continually give information to. They have generally positive reporting in the media, and people like Chris.
Fuck it, let's get into it now. Who are the columnists in the city, or Where does the pro cop information get leaked? Because I've seen it where, it's clearly, or often it appears to be someone within the police union going after someone criticizing them. I remember, this isn't even in Montreal, and I'm sorry I'm asking you a question, but I'm providing my own anecdote. But when those women came forward in Val d'Or, there were 12 Indigenous women who came forward with claims that they had been sexually assaulted by Sûreté du Québec officers in this mining city called Val d'Or. There was a significant amount of evidence brought forward by them. It had been, a lot of what they said had been kind of common knowledge for years in Val d'Or, even among white people, and especially among these Indigenous communities. And then they come forward with this big report on Radio-Canada, and it's humiliating to the police, and these police officers are suspended, and one of the whistleblowers in the days after, her criminal record is like front page, oh yes, this woman who says she was raped has also been charged with assaulting a police officer, and she's a really bad mom, and she's done this, and sources inside the police department say that. It's almost like they had this dossier ready to go, saying like, okay, you're going to come after us, we're going to go after your witnesses. And this is the last thing I'll say on this, they had sent one of their private investigators to go after one of the sources. So like they do also wage this information war, and I it sounds silly, but it is, like, when you're dealing with people's lives, it is kind of an information war. So I'm so sorry. Let's get into that. Let's get into the information war.
Sure. I mean, so the two main journalists in Montreal who do the work of the police are Pascal Robida with Radio-Canada and Daniel Renaud with La Presse. And so I read them all the time because it's incredibly informative, because they get information from anonymous police sources all the time, and then they just report it. And so it's a good source of information, but the bias is incredible, So the average reader is going to think that this is sort of like relatively objective reporting on crime, when it's really not. They really, really serve the agenda of not even necessarily the police department, but the police brotherhood. And so,
do you I'm sorry, do you, like, in these situations, right? Like, because I know both those journalists, and they're awesome. They're really good people, and they're super hardworking, and their stuff is accurate. Like, can you understand, if you're them and you get this piece of privileged information, like, can you understand the impulse to report it? And do you think maybe there's a way of doing it better?
I think, they've made a career for themselves based on this privileged access to information. And they do provide information that other people don't. But if they were to be more critical, they would stop getting the information. So again, this is a bit more of a structural critique. Yeah. The same way that, like, lots of cops are great people, but this institution leads them to do things that are on a broad scale kind of harmful. I would say the same thing about journalists that just regurgitate what they're given by the police.
Or even, like, there's political reporters, you get leaked something, it's obviously weaponized to hurt another politician. Like, you kind of become part of the game without maybe realizing it, or you tacitly accept it as, look, this is just, if it's not me, someone else is going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, like, Axios in the US in the context of the genocide in Gaza, another story, but, like, they are constantly reporting this inside information that Biden is upset with what Israel is doing in Gaza. I mean, on the surface, what Biden is doing is just cheerleading this genocide, sending them everything they want, doing diplomatic cover, etc. But, every 2 weeks, there'll be, like, this leak that privately Biden is upset. And it's like, only Axios is reporting that. And it's like, you're really doing the bidding of this government, which is trying to both unequivocally support Israel and also make it seem like they're, like, reflecting on it constantly. Anyways, so there are journalists that do this, right? And I think that they're not gonna give information to Savannah Craig because obviously they don't see her as. I think she's an objective reporter, right? But she's embeds herself in movements, and she'll be at the Scotia Square direct action, for example, and we'll just report what's going on. It would be much nicer for the police if she were to just sit in her office and wait for the police to give her information and then report that. So, what both Pascal Robidas and Daniel Renaud have been reporting on lately is this phenomenon of people who are stealing cars and who like try to run over police officers. And so they just say that this is a phenomenon. People who are trying to steal cars are doing this all the time. And part of the reason
that sounds like the dumbest crime ever. Like, why would you just like? It sounds extremely exceptional.
No, and it feeds into this idea that like the criminals don't respect the police anymore. It's because of defund the police. It's because of Black Lives Matter. And the police shot a guy 3 times a month ago who they alleged was stealing a car. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. He ended up in a coma. He'll probably live. He's still in the hospital. And the police are immediately saying that he tried to kill the police officer, and the police officer was acting in self-defense. Both Daniel Renaud and Pascal Robidas reported on that. They got a bunch of anonymous sources who said that, as well as a retired police officer who's always interviewed when there's an incident of police violence and always says it's fine. And then the video comes out of the incident. That didn't happen. That didn't happen at all. The car was stopped by the police, and it decided to drive away, and we can criticize that. But the police officer's life was not in danger, and he fired 3 times at the driver of the car, and then the car crashes. Back to the encampment, right? We've seen a brutal crackdown on the actions on April 15th, which were disruptive actions, intentionally so. We're going to disrupt business at Scotiabank because of its investments in an Israeli weapons company. We're going to disrupt the port to show that like we can't have business as usual when our country, all these companies are supporting a genocide, and the police were very brutal towards it. A week later, we had the start of the McGill encampment, which is disruptive to McGill, but not really anything else. That's all they're doing. And so I think the police made a decision that like, this is kind of what we want. We don't want more of this blocking the port, occupying Scotiabank. So let's sort of monitor this. We'll do intelligence gathering. We'll send in undercover cops. We'll have drones flying over to see what's going on. And we'll, potentially bring charges against people, especially if things change, where we're going to let it remain. And then McGill, has repeatedly demanded that the police intervene to resolve this situation, and we can see what police resolving encampments looks like when they do it in the United States, in Calgary, in Edmonton. It's a violent attack. That's what the police do. They don't have another sort of mechanism that they can use to remove people who don't want to be removed. The police have refused. And then McGill asked for an injunction saying we want to force the police to attack our students. To some people's surprise, including mine, the SPVM asked to be an intervener in the injunction case. So they went to the court during the hearing about the injunction, and they said, police discretion is important. We want to retain the right to intervene at the time and in the manner that we choose. And essentially, like, we're not the private security guards for McGill University. And so you have this weird situation where McGill is essentially trying to insert itself at the head of the police department and tell police what to do. And the police are like, no, we do what we want, which is a strange thing, right? Because we're the police, we do what we want. This principle of police discretion is at the foundation of like the worst police abuses, the worst police violence, police racism. It's the reason that police are not accountable to the population and can't be made to be accountable. So it's usually a terrible thing. And in this case, it turned out to be a good thing. But then if you switch to UQAM, the attack on that encampment occurred on Monday when the camp organized a direct action where they were going to block 3 intersections near the UQAM campus, set up barricades, brought out music. It was going to be a real celebratory kind of action. But the police responded to it in the same ways that they've been responding to other direct actions, with incredible violence. And some of the riot squad did what they're trained to do. You sort of you march forward with your shield. You big, very, very deliberate actions to push people back. And when they did that, the activists moved back. That's what they're trained to do. It worked. We can say that they should have just let the activists hold the street, and I would be in favor of that. But they were doing what they were trained to do. Other cops just came in with batons first and just started beating people, and then beating them on the ground, and then shooting pepper spray at them. That's how. So I would see that as part of a counterinsurgency strategy, where they're like, if you do direct action, we're going to attack you. If you're going to have an encampment on a university property, for now, we're going to let you do that.
Yeah. Yeah. The way that some cops were, I spoke to someone who was there, and they sent me the name of one of the cops who they say was there. I haven't confirmed it, but so you look up the name in the database, and you see this super long list of complaints against this police officer for brutality. Wow. You think like, oh yeah, that's right. You can have like more or less 1 million complaints, and the only thing it'll ever really do is maybe you might not get a promotion or something, or you might,
sensitivity training.
Yeah, yes, some sensitivity training.
You might get suspended without pay. Suspended with pay, which sounds to me like a vacation.
Yeah. I'll take more suspensions, please.
Yeah. So I'm going to push back a little just because I like doing that. Everything you're saying sounds very steeped in bias, and let's say someone who is not me or Chris hears that. I feel like they would go, okay, stats. Like it sounds like you're making a judgment based on your opinion as opposed to like something based in hard evidence. And so what would you say in reply to that?
So what do you want hard evidence for? The idea
so like you're talking about the insurgency, like anti-insurgency work, or like how they're just like, no, we're in control. Like, because you could also present the police as being like, well, we don't see them as doing something illegal, therefore we're not going to arrest them. Like you could present how they've reacted to the McGill encampments as a very positive thing, but you're presenting it as like a double-edged sword, which is it's walking on eggshells there, like, so what would be your response to somebody who's going, well, you're just talking out of bias, you don't have any hard evidence or proof that the police are acting this way because of this?
I don't think that I do have enough evidence to really demonstrate that this is exactly what's happening right now, because I don't think there's enough evidence of what's happening. All we have are like observations of how the police are behaving and some public statements by the police that I don't think that we can normally treat as truth. And so we kind of have to try to find a way to explain what's happening, ideally based on like an historical analysis. And so, we can talk about how, for example, in the 1980s, in Montreal, where we had the largest kind of movement against police racism and violence, as a result of tremendous violence against Black people in the city, the killing of Anthony Griffin, a Black teenager in 1987. We had these like very broad-based movements that included Black communities, included like labor, included like civil rights groups, etc. And the way that the police responded to that was first to do all of these kind of community policing initiatives. So we're going to hire more Black cops. We're going to create more meetings where the police will meet with Black organizations, civil rights organizations, etc. We're going to do a bunch of sensitivity training, etc. So a bunch of things that are about winning some people over to supporting the police. They also hired a bunch of like Black youth, and every time the police got criticized for killing someone, they would send that like 18-year-old to the media to tell the media about how nice the police are. So this is really public relations. It's winning people over. The second thing they did is launched a war on street gangs in 1989, which street gangs have existed in Montreal going back to the mid-1800s. They're a thing in any large city. Yeah. What was different in the 1980s is that you began to see Black gangs. And so they launched this.
It's almost like you wrote a book about this, by the way.
Did you write a book about this?
Yeah. Ted wrote a book about this. I just wanted to like plug it. It's what you're talking about. You've done a significant amount of research on this. You co-wrote a book about Montreal's first Black street gang with one of the gang members.
Wow. And, okay. That's crazy, man.
Yeah. So sorry, I just wanted to like stop. And
so Ted
happens to be a bit of an authority on this.
This is not secondhand information. Or this is not third-hand information. What is it?
This is research from like 100 interviews with cops who were involved in this. It's interview with.
This is the guy. So if y'all are like, this guy doesn't know shit, he wrote the book.
He wrote the book. That's great.
But whatever authority that gives you in this day and age.
Yeah. He wrote the book a while ago.
Yeah.
Which pre-Amazon?
Months ago. No. This is a recent book.
Okay, never mind.
This is live.
He's not an authority at all.
Yeah.
Old news. But they do this
Carry
war
on.
Gangs, right? And so, which effectively is a war on Black communities. The police, an internal report from the police in 1989 looked at the street gang landscape and found that the majority of gangs were white. They're mostly skinhead gangs, so like just racist white people attacking people of color, gay men, Jews. They decided not to go after them. They only went after Haitian youth for 1 year. And then in the second year, they expanded the war to include also Black Anglophones. And they could do that because they're saying, we're not going after Black people, we're going after gangs, which we imagined to be Black. So at one time, on the one hand, they're like trying to bring people in through community policing. On the other hand, they're like hyper criminalizing and terrorizing people who have any association with street gangs. And so I think that we can understand that as counterinsurgency. You're trying to win people over, but you're also using that extra support to vilify, criminalize, and harm some segment of the population. And again, like people in the comments might be like, oh, well, like gangs cause violence. It's like, of course, like some gang members are involved in some horrible shit. I'm not excusing that at all. I'm saying that this was not a response to the violence of gangs. Otherwise, they would have gone after the white gangs, which were actually more violent. So this isn't about safety. And secondly, you know, if we wanted more safety, we could deal with the conditions that lead people to be involved in gangs, whether it's skinheads or like street gangs. We could deal with those things rather than, you know, sending, you know, hundreds of people to prison on mostly minor crimes. Some gang members were involved in some nefarious shit. Most were not. And they send everyone to prison, like, because they're trying to criminalize the entire social group. They want to eliminate the gang rather than arrest people for their crimes. And so lots of people went to prison, you know, for drug possession, for breaking bail conditions, for what the police love to charge marginalized people with obstruction of justice, which is a very easy thing to level on someone.
They got in the way.
Mostly just people plead guilty and they get probation or they get a short jail term. But then the next thing they get caught for is a lot more serious because they have a criminal record. So we could go on and on, but like,
no, you know what's crazy?
This is the way the police operate, and you know, some people would say, well, that's good. They should be harder on the direct action than an encampment. That's fine. Like, you can say that, but you're not telling me that this isn't what's happening.
What were you going to say, Chris?
Well, it was a bit of an aside, so I don't.
All right. I would like to ask you about. Me and Chris were discussing before the podcast the budget in Montreal, how the police every single year goes significantly over budget. And what are the stats on the budget? Do you guys know, or should I just look that up right now?
It's like roughly $1 billion every year?
It's
and growing?
$850 million in Montreal. And yeah, so the Montreal Police Department since 2019 has gone over budget by an average of $35 million every year. In the past couple of years, it's been closer to $60 million. And Montreal is the only large police department in Canada that does this.
Okay, so it's 787 billion, or sorry, million. Holy shit, 787 million was the budget, and they went over by a fair bit. So why is Montreal the only place that does that then?
Well, I mean, I'll answer that, but then it sort of like requires another question. I mean, because the city government lets them, and so every time the police go over budget, the city just cuts them a check. Whereas when the public transit authority comes in under budget, basically like because they didn't have enough revenue, by the same amount, so it's the same budgetary problem. There's a $60 million gap on the side of the police and the public transit authority. The city government forces the public transit authority to make cuts, to fire employees, to cut services. Whereas with the police, they just cut them a check and then give them a budget increase for the next year. Then we have to ask, why would they do that? And that's, you know, then we're entering into the realm of conjecture and theory.
Philosophy. That's philosophy.
I mean, there's a couple of things, but you have to understand that, like, the police. Well, first of all, there is like the way that we oversee. So like when Valérie Plante, when their administration came to power in 2017, you know, there was going to be more transparency. There were going to be more of these studies. We were going to have these public meetings where we can watch the police answer questions from politicians. And these all seem like good things. but tangentially, like nothing really changed. It was just sort of it felt like appeasement. Mm-hmm. Am I wrong? Am I out to lunch here?
Yeah, I think it probably was. I mean, I think it functioned as appeasement. I think it's also a good thing. Like, I attended those.
Yeah.
First place I ever met you was at one of those hearings. And I think it was a good thing because it allowed citizens to come and ask questions to the police. Now we get to do that once or twice a year at the budget hearings. And so you have about 5 people show up and you can ask the police questions and they have to answer you. They can lie or they can dodge your question, but they have to answer you. So these public hearings, even though they didn't change much, I think were a good thing. And then they've stopped doing that. You know, in the second mandate of Projet Montréal, we have very, very few meetings where you can ask questions of the police. And I guess the other thing I would say is that at those meetings in the late aughts, there was discussions of racial profiling, and people were demanding, you know, real actions to reduce the level of racial profiling. And what came out of it was this decision that we would force the police to release data on police stops. We would have some independent researchers evaluate that to understand the extent of racial profiling, and then we would do something. Mm-hmm. And so the first report comes out in 2019, shows these stats that Chris cited. You know, Black and Indigenous men are 4 times more likely to be stopped than white men. Indigenous women are 11 or 12 times more likely to be stopped than white women. And then we didn't do anything. And then we have a new report that came out last year that showed that things have either stayed the same or gotten worse, and we still don't do anything. So it's just they sort of kick the can down the road.
But wasn't there a street checks policy? Didn't this administration have a hard-nosed, no more street checks?
No, they said they have to have a reason to street check. And like in the interviews that I've done with police officers, like I didn't ask them specifically about this, but they would talk to me about how they, you know, occupied Montréal Nord or Saint Michel to try to get the names of all young Haitians. And I was like, you can't just stop people randomly. They're like, no, you can't. You have to have a reason, but you can always make up a reason. They were walking too slowly. They were walking too fast. They looked into a window. They looked at a car. So
they stood near a known gang member.
Yeah. And so people who are paying attention, I think, were like, well, this policy requiring police to have a reason isn't going to do anything. And then we have a report that comes out last year that shows, indeed, it didn't change anything, and we don't do anything. Like, you know,
one of the crazy things here. So, like, one of my very first story with the Montreal Gazette was an investigation into Groupe Eclipse, the anti-street gang, and this is kind of crazy. I was in school and I submitted for like a project. I was like, oh, I'll submit an access to information request, and I wanted to know, you know, if at the time Groupe Eclipse. They were under a lot of pressure because the Freddie Villanueva shooting, an unarmed teenager was killed by the cops. You know, it was still in the news, or it was still in our consciousness, and there was rightfully an association between over-policing Montréal Nord and the street gang unit that was taking credit for a big reduction in gang violence in Montréal Nord. So I submit this access to information request asking, like, all right, well, what, you know, please detail the arrests and the seizures that this group has done, because surely if they've reduced crime in this neighborhood, then there should be all kinds of arrests for possession of a gun, for attempted murder, for whatever. And I believe, you know, so we went over something like 4 years of arrest statistics. I think it was 80% of the crimes people were arrested for were not violent. And the majority of those were simple possession of narcotics, which could be, you know, you have weed isn't legal at the time. So you have, you know, a joint on you. And the other big one was violating the conditions of your probation. So like it could be you're outside past 9 o'clock, or you're outside of, you're on this specific street corner that you're not allowed to be on. So when I confronted the police with those facts, they said, well, look, we're not like we're gathering intelligence. We're just gathering intelligence. And that kind of confounded me. But then I was like, okay, go on. And the cop, I mean, God bless him. He was doing his best. But he goes on to explain something extremely unconstitutional. And he goes, well, so here's how we do it. We used to just police a certain neighborhood where there was a lot of crime. Now what we do is we follow a known gang member. And by the way, like, what is a known gang member? That's a really nebulous concept. It's not like the Hells Angels where you have like a patch and everything. Mm-hmm. We follow a known gang member. And if they're with someone and we don't know that person, we'll just then follow that person. It's like, what?
What?
Yeah. He said this in the interview in black and white. And that is the reason that I'm a journalist today, is because I wrote that story and the Gazette was like, all right, this kid's not a moron, even though he presents as one. Fuck. Anyhow, so I just like, and that too was part of this cycle that you're speaking about of like, you know, there's this controversy around this gang unit and the shooting of this unarmed teenager. So what we'll do is we'll hire more black people or more people of color, more people that reflect the diversity of the city, more sensitivity training. We're going to meet with these kids. And interestingly, one of the candidates for Montreal police chief attended Freddie Villanueva's funeral. And that is actually what no longer made him a viable candidate. The police would not accept that one of their own attended the funeral of an unarmed child who was killed by the cops. And,
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Sorry. That's a big aside.
I was wondering, Ted, could you, so I get really frustrated sometimes when people throw stats at me and I'm like, well, that's the stats from the United States of America, but that's not stats from Canada. We often do that in Canada. Here's the stats, but you're like, that's not the stats in Canada at all. Can you tell me about race and policing in Canada? Because if I were to assume, I would say that the police are probably more against Indigenous people than black people in Canada, but I don't know that for a fact. Whereas in the States, it's not. That's the opposite, right? So could you tell me about that a little bit here?
Sure. So I mean, I think they're against both black and Indigenous people.
Fair enough.
As well as, like,
agreed.
People are marginalized in other kinds of ways. And part of the difference that we see is just the different makeup of cities in Canada. And so, like, overwhelmingly, the violence in Vancouver, in Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Regina is against Indigenous people. I mean, it's a simple thing to say that it's because there's a larger Indigenous population there. I don't think that gets to the core of it. In Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax, you see more violence against black people because there are larger black populations. In places where there have been studies done, you know, you see that, like the stat that Chris cited in Montreal, in terms of police stops, these random police stops for which we have data, black and Indigenous men are stopped at the same rate, and then Indigenous women are stopped at a 12 times the rate of white women. And like, that's a thing, that's where I think the major difference we see comes from, is like the overwhelming violence against Indigenous women. You know, half the women in federal prisons are Indigenous. I mean, most people don't know that, and it's disproportionate on the male side as well, but less so. And so, you know, if we're talking about race, we also need to talk about gender, because this level of violence against Indigenous women is
Let's do it. Yeah, I'd like to know more.
And is it? I mean, do you see an association with? Look, all of these Indigenous women who are arrested, like, they come into contact with the police repeatedly.
Yeah.
And yet for years and years and years, and to this day, Indigenous women are the victims of violence and homicide, and so few of them. I mean, is there a sign that this over-policing of Indigenous women is creating a problem of trust, where, like, Indigenous women won't go to the police if they're really in trouble, or and that in a way is kind of totally defeats the purpose of the police being the protector?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is often what we find is people are over-policed and underprotected, and that's overwhelmingly the case for Indigenous women. You know, we have a phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. You know, obviously some police officers are devoted to trying to deal with that, but overall, the police are not addressing that. At the same time that the police are sending tons of people to prison, tons of Indigenous women to prison for often minor crimes, sometimes serious things. But, you know, obviously the problem goes beyond the police, right? Like, this should be a shocking piece of news that 50% of women in federal prisons are Indigenous women. Like, stop everything and figure out what we need to do to stop. Yeah. And a lot of it is not necessarily changing the way the police operate. It's actually like just addressing root causes of harm and vulnerability. And again, it's like, because we believe the police keep us safe, we don't do all the other things that actually do keep us safe. And, you know, and again, you know,
It's a lot easier though. You give the cops money, you're safe, right? It's an easy solution to an extremely complicated problem.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing is, like, if you look at juvenile detention facilities in the prairies, it's 90% Indigenous. And so we have this broad recognition that residential schools were this horrible thing that happened, and yet we're still throwing Indigenous kids into institutions.
Yeah.
Probably at the same rate.
There are more kids in the foster care system and in those institutions today than there were at the height of the residential school system. So it hasn't gone anywhere. It's the same sort of institutionalization of babies, kids. You're breaking up families. There have been progress, and there has been some progress, and there is a recognition that you don't break families up. But you're right. Once the child becomes institutionalized, like, it is a very difficult thing to lose. Once you're in the system, like, the reflex is always more system. We need more system, when in fact, like, Jesus Christ, the kid just needs a break.
Yeah. And in one way that we can, enter that debate also is to recognize that a lot of Indigenous people, are fighting for Indigenous sovereignty. Like, they want to be sovereign. They believe they are sovereign. And if that's the case, like, every Indigenous person stopped by the police or incarcerated by the Canadian prison system is an injustice, because we're asserting the Canadian colonial system into Indigenous communities, into Indigenous lives. That doesn't mean that, there aren't Indigenous people who are doing something wrong and that there shouldn't be ways of dealing with it. But ideally, we would get to a situation from this perspective, and I agree with it, that Indigenous people would have control over the ways that they deal with harm and insecurity in their own communities, because that's what it would mean to be sovereign. And so I learn a lot from Indigenous people, activists, writers, who are like, we had other ways of dealing with harm prior to colonization. We still have those ways of dealing with harm, and we need to be given the self-determining capacities to deal with these things ourselves. And so I just want to say that, because when we get into these statistics, it makes it seem like if we just get the number of Indigenous women in prisons down to like 4%, that would be justice. And, like, obviously that'd be way better. I'm for that, but ideally we would also go towards something quite different, which is
and more culturally appropriate. And I wanted to flip this for a second and ask Isaac and you something. What the big on the federal scene right now, probably the biggest issue that the conservatives and the liberals are kind of battling it out over in terms of policing is the decriminalization of drugs. Pierre Poilievre says, look, it's happened in Vancouver. It's happened in British Columbia. It's been a total and utter failure. In the United States, you've seen jurisdictions that have decriminalized drugs and then reversed their course really quickly because things got dramatically worse. You've lived in Vancouver, right? And you've lived in a homeless encampment. Like, you have, I think, a good grasp of the overdose crisis. And Ted, this is an issue I know you follow closely. So I'm just curious to get both of your thoughts on this.
Ted, do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Well, I am no expert at all in this one, obviously. But basically, my experience of what has occurred in Vancouver in regards to how badly it has been going recently has almost nothing to do with the decriminalization of drugs. But have you guys ever been to East Hastings in Vancouver?
I've never been to Vancouver.
Oh, no?
Well, I mean, when I was 12.
Okay, quick. Sure, yeah, but not as an adult.
Yeah.
So basically, actually, it's so funny. My best friend from British Columbia is here right now, and she used to we used to take teenagers to the downtown east side to show them what, like, urbanization was and show them kind of what East Hastings was like. So we would take camps during the summer of teenagers just down there and be like, this is what it's like in East Hastings. And we would volunteer at food shelters and stuff like that and teach them about, like, what it is in an urban setting, and like kind of the major problems that we're faced with in Vancouver and stuff like that, right? And basically, like, there was this incredible community, okay? You'd go down to East Hastings and there'd be kids would bring teenagers, and you'd hear someone shout, kids on the block. And then every single meth pipe, every single needle, gone, disappeared, just gone. Because and you would just hear just kids on the block, and then down the road, kids on the block, just around the block. And everyone would hide all their drug paraphernalia. Because the community was so well organized and so established on East Hastings in Vancouver that they just went, no, we don't screw around with kids like that. If there's kids, you stop.
Yeah.
And because they know the kids are coming by, it's not a big deal. And then, after the kids are gone, they're good. And everyone pulls it out again, right? But what happened, I believe it was 2 years ago in 2022 now, when the police literally destroyed the encampment over on East Hastings. Basically, it was a huge community, it was tent city, right? And the police destroyed it. You can go look up the videos on YouTube, on TikTok, of the police absolutely becoming super violent and cracking down on the people who lived on East Hastings. Okay, did you guys see that?
No.
Yeah, you did see that, Ted? It was intense. Okay, but I will tell you that since then, there's tent city is gone.
Yeah.
Even though it was like straight up an establishment of Vancouver, right? For like 20 years. It has gotten significantly more violent all over Vancouver because you have taken this extremely sensitive and like poor population who has a proclivity towards maybe some violence and stuff like that because of mental illness, because of drug addiction. We can be honest that is true. And you've dispersed them around the entire city. It's not so much
the mental illness or it's the fact that you're outside.
It's a million factors.
It's a tense situation.
It's poverty. It's mental illness. It's drug addiction. It's fully just like a system that has completely failed this group of people. And now you've dispersed them all over the city. So before, every single group that was helping these people was focused in East Hastings. They had easy access to help these people. You had easy access they could bring condoms, they could bring sanitary facilities, they could bring food, all these things to one spot. And now you have the same population dispersed everywhere in Vancouver.
Yeah.
And so you're walking around a random neighborhood and you'll start having someone who gets aggressive with you and you're like, whoa, like I didn't expect this in this random neighborhood that I'm in.
Yeah.
And it's because they are now completely disenfranchised and don't even have a community to support them.
Yeah.
Because before, at least in East Hastings, there was a community that took care of them.
And imagine drug testing too,
There was drug testing. There was a million safe injection sites down there.
Yeah.
Like it was an amazing area where people were like, cool, we've basically the entire city's like crime population was focused in one spot, which made the rest of the city astoundingly safe. And then that one area was still pretty safe because it was easy to manage. It was easy to take care of these people. And there was still, dead bodies that would show up. There was still people who would overdose. These problems were still there, obviously. But you have now dispersed that problem all over the city with no way to help these people and no way to actually care for this community. And then people are like, well, it's because of the decriminalization of drugs. And you're like, no, it's because the police got violent.
Yeah.
And that's my view. I have, minimal stats, but that's how I've seen it happen. Ted, I'm sorry for talking so long, man.
No, I love this, by the way. I love hearing about your life because I learn things. I'm sorry. I appreciate you, Isaac.
Appreciate you, man. Go ahead, Ted. What would you say in response to what I've said, for example?
Yeah, no, I think that's wise. I mean, I think Polyev is making this about decriminalization, but what is he really talking about, and why are people buying it? I think that what we've actually seen is, sort of what you're talking about, Isaac, is there's an increase in homelessness, there's an increase in people suffering with mental illness, etc. And so people who aren't in that situation are encountering more unhoused people, more people who are suffering in their daily lives. And it's, people are uncomfortable about it. Sometimes stuff happens, like some kind of harassment or some kind of violence. But you also, when you look at what people are talking about when they're interviewed in the media or whatever about this increasing insecurity, it's often just someone being there or someone yelling or someone asking for money. A lot of times people just have been socialized to fear marginalized people, even when there's nothing to fear. And so I think Polyev is mobilizing that sentiment, and he's saying that it's all about decriminalizing drugs. And of course, that's not it. Of course, that's not it. What he's really saying is we're going to, augment the police intervention in people's lives. We're going to augment their punishment, and he might come to power on that, and he'll implement a bunch of things. And 4 years down the line, we'll realize that the things got even worse. And then, I don't know what will happen, but like nobody, including the liberals, obviously, are campaigning on what would actually address the problem, which is, an increase in homelessness, an increase in untreated mental illness, and an increasingly toxic drug supply. I mean, no one who was organizing with drug users, including drug users in the downtown east side, was saying that drug decriminalization would stop overdoses entirely.
No.
They said it's a good thing to do. It will reduce overdoses to some extent. No one thought it was going to solve the problem. That it needed to be viewed within a larger harm reduction framework, and we did a very small thing. And then people like Polyev, and then the NDP premier of British Columbia, David Eby, can say it failed. It's like, it probably succeeded. It's just that the success was always going to be very, very, very small. We need to do a bunch of other things.
That is you're right. There's a huge factor that we're not considering is the explosion of homelessness over the last 6 years. In Montreal, the unhoused population almost doubled since the last count, which was, I think, in 2018, to where I believe it's now like 8,000 people sleeping outside every night or in shelters or in the system. And similar statistics can be observed out west and across right now across North America and probably even the world, just because housing affordability is so out of control. But it's unfortunate that it's being weaponized like that, because the consequences, people will continue to suffer. People will continue to die. People will continue to be thrown in jail for bullshit. And that doesn't make life easier for cops, and that doesn't make life easier for prison guards, and we're throwing more human beings into an incredibly dehumanizing system.
You know what grinds my gears?
No. Tell us.
It makes me very angry. I am a devout Christian, okay? And so I believe in the sanctity of every individual life. Like, I think that these homeless people are extremely important, okay?
Yeah.
Extremely important. I think that every single person walking on earth right now deserves dignity and life. And then you see people like Polyev using these people who are suffering as an agenda to increase his power. And I'm like, dude, fuck you. You have dehumanized these. And I lived, by the way, in the homeless encampment during COVID because I was living in a van. I was homeless by choice, but then you're friends with everyone and you're like, this is the best. And fuck anyone who uses human beings as an agenda to gain power and money.
I understand.
It makes me so angry.
It
makes me so angry.
You're right. You're using, like, that's someone's suffering. That's someone's
someone's real life.
And you don't really care. Or
no,
at least
it's cynical.
Your actions don't show that you don't care.
No, exactly.
Your words and you might look very kind on the camera and say like, oh, what a tragedy. But there's what we say and there's what we do. And I think, unfortunately, you can only really be judged by what you do.
The only things that matter are what you do. And frankly, people like that only do self-beneficial things. And like, okay, a good example is like Danielle Smith. I can't stand that woman, but Danielle
the
Smith,
Alberta Premier, yeah.
The Albertan Premier, she's like, we are stopping all trans medical care until people are 18 because we care about the trans youth. And I'm like, shut up.
Yeah.
You don't care about the trans youth.
You don't even think we should exist.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
That's my people, man.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's me being emotional.
No, I love
and not grounded in facts, y'all. So
no.
Sorry for getting emotional. That, like, I know that's not, but it really upsets me when people are being used.
I think a lot of what's happening, I oscillate between like being really sad or being enraged, because it's both of those things, and man, we live in this time where all of our social and ecological problems are getting way worse. There's so much suffering, and nobody nobody in the political sphere is campaigning on actually solving them. No. Towards the left end of the political sphere, we have people campaigning on small things that might make things get worse a little bit slower. And then you have people like Polyev who are campaigning on things that will make things way worse. And won't even solve the problem of like the Monsieur et Madame tout le monde. Like, it's not, like Chris said, right? It's people who get upset by seeing unhoused people or people who are using drugs. It's not even going to make things better for them because you're not solving any of the problems. And so it's just going to be like 4 years from now, we're going to be calling for even more punishment or even more police incarceration. You know, Danielle Smith is going towards like forced drug treatment, which is like very, very vicious, you know?
Is there anything you want to say in closing statements, Ted?
No, I really appreciate this discussion, right? And I think one of the things we've seen just is, you know, keep coming back to this idea that we're seeing police violence, police interventions as a solution to all kinds of social problems. And no one is saying that like there's no role for the police today in our society, but that we're bypassing, you know, the root core of problems, and that we need to have like a broader discussion that includes lots of kind of, you know, policies and solutions to uplift people's lives and to make sure that we're all, you know, a lot safer than we are today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, God bless you, Ted. Thanks for the work
Ted.
you do,
really
man.
Appreciate it. Guys, if you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, check out the podcast, the audio version of the podcast if you just want this on the go. And check out the rover.ca/support-us. That's the rover.ca/support-us. Chris's child is imminently going to starve to death if you don't give him cash right now. So please go on there, sign up for the free newsletter, or give money for the paid.
Not a single
newsletter.
exaggeration in there, and we will include all of Ted Rutland's information, even the stuff he doesn't want you to know, in the
like
show's
his address.
bio. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Ted. Ted, you're the best. Guys, have a great day, and go take a bath.